With the fall of the Soviet regime, liberation surged throughout Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, former satellite states of the USSR, quickly transitioned from communist regimes to democratic governments, while Germany reunified into a singular democratic entity. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former USSR annexed territories, gained independence and rapidly shifted to democratic governments and free market economies. Not only did NATO no longer face the threat of the Soviet Union, the entirety of Eastern Europe now ideologically and politically resembled the West. With the Soviet Union gone and the majority of Eastern Europe acting as a buffer zone between Russia and the West, NATO no longer had a legitimate reason to exist. Who was NATO defending its membership countries from? Many would point to Russia. However, the Russian Federation expected to fraternize with the Pan-European Alliance and join NATO. Russia seriously considered NATO membership, starting with Russian President Boris Yeltsin's 1991 letter to NATO, stating, quote, "This would contribute to an atmosphere of mutual understanding and trust, and would strengthen stability and cooperation on the European continent. We regard this relationship as serious and wish to develop this dialogue on all fronts, both on the political and military levels. Today we raise the issue of Russia's membership in NATO. However, we see this as a long-term political goal," end quote. In 1993, former Secretary of State James Baker, in a formal document, outlined reasons NATO leaders should seek Russia as a member, the strongest reason being Russian membership could have a, quote, "constructive role in European security," end quote. Yeltsin goes on to pursue NATO membership for Russia in a 1994 meeting with American President Bill Clinton. Quote, "Russia has to be the first country to join NATO. Then the others from Central and Eastern Europe can come in," end quote. The 1994 NATO initiative Partnership for Peace, likely stemming from Russia's expressed intent to join the organization, was created to engage in military cooperation between NATO, Russia, and former Soviet-controlled countries. Yeltsin believed joining the Partnership for Peace initiative would serve as a compromise. NATO could guarantee military security to Eastern European countries while refraining from expanding NATO eastward. However, to Yeltsin's dismay, NATO clarified the Partnership for Peace initiative would serve as a stepping stone to full NATO membership. Yeltsin, reiterating his opposition to NATO expanding eastward, remained a Partnership for Peace member and continued cooperation with NATO. As early as 1997, Yeltsin outlined the Russian red lines for their national security, hoping to engage in a legally binding agreement. Quote, "Nuclear and conventional arms cannot move eastward into new members to the borders of Russia, thus creating a new cordon sanitaire aimed at Russia. But one thing is very important. Enlargement shouldn't embrace the former Soviet republics. I cannot sign any agreement without such language, especially Ukraine. If you get them involved, it will create difficulties in our talks with Ukraine on a number of issues," end quote. Russia's weak geopolitical situation forced Yeltsin to settle with the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, a major development in relations between NATO and Russia. The act asserts, quote, "NATO and Russia do not consider each other as adversaries. They share the goal of overcoming the vestiges of earlier confrontation and competition, and of strengthening mutual trust and cooperation," end quote. The act goes on to define, quote, "the goals and mechanism of consultation, cooperation, joint decision-making, and joint action that will constitute the core of the mutual relations between NATO and Russia," end quote. Russia repeatedly opposed the potential spread of NATO to incorporate former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In the Russian 1997 National Security Blueprint, President Yeltsin explicitly stated, quote, "NATO expansion is unacceptable and a threat to Russian security," end quote. despite the diplomatic and cooperation stipulations guaranteed by the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. NATO took advantage of Russia's geopolitical weakness by completely disregarding the Russian Federation's requests for national security and welcomed all three of the former Warsaw Pact countries into the alliance in 1999. Was this necessary? Could it have been feasible to utilize the Partnership for Peace initiative as an alternative to NATO expansion? Doing this would have provided security both for Russia and the former Soviet satellite states. As power transferred from Yeltsin to Putin, Russia's intention to join NATO remained. When asked about his views on NATO, Putin responded, quote, "We believe we can talk about more profound integration with NATO, but only if Russia is regarded an equal partner," end quote. Obviously intrigued, the interviewer asked whether it was possible Russia could join NATO, to which Putin responded, quote, "I don't see why not. I would not rule out such a possibility, but I repeat, if and when Russia's views are taken into account as those of an equal partner," end quote. Between 1999 and 2003, Putin discussed his intentions to join NATO with Secretary General of NATO, George Robertson. According to Robertson, Putin asked him, quote, "When are you going to invite Russia to join NATO?" Robertson responded by saying, quote, "Well, we don't invite countries to join NATO, they apply to join NATO." Putin responds by saying, quote, "Well, we are not going to stand in line beside a bunch of countries that don't matter," end quote. Robertson goes on to say, quote, "I think he wanted it presented to him because I think he always thought and increasingly thinks that Russia is a great nation on the world stage," end quote. Another former NATO Secretary General, Anders Rasmussen, after meeting with Putin in the early 2000s, quote, "got the impression Russia was pro-Western and open to joining the transatlantic alliance." Finally, in an interview with American filmmaker Oliver Stone, Putin revealed that he asked President Bill Clinton whether it could be possible for Russia to join NATO. Clinton responded, quote, "I don't see why not," end quote, but was quickly shut down by his advisors. Instead of welcoming Russia into the alliance, or at the very least upholding the security assurances promised by Western diplomats like James Baker and Hans Genscher, NATO continued to march eastward with zero regard for the Kremlin's input. Even as a member in the Partnership for Peace, which according to NATO served as a blueprint for NATO membership, NATO never seriously considered the Russians' reasonable requests to be treated as an equal partner in order to create lasting peace on the continent. In addition, it is not out of the norm for NATO to invite countries to join their organization. Despite Russia's willingness to cooperate and tighten relations, the United States reversed course in 2001 by unilaterally withdrawing from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This treaty intended to, quote, "reduce pressures to build more nuclear weapons to maintain deterrence," end quote. Both the Russian political elite and Western political scientists viewed the withdrawal as exploitative and foundational to Russia's distrust in American political desires. The Brookings Institution, prior to the withdrawal, declared a, quote, "unilateral withdrawal would be a foreign policy disaster. Russia would respond by abandoning its commitment under the START II treaty to slash nuclear forces," end quote. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace argues the withdrawal, quote, "has fueled a new arms race," end quote. Uncoincidentally, the U.S. withdrawal was followed by signed bilateral agreements between Poland, Romania, and the United States. Against Russian wishes, the U.S., with NATO support, could build ballistic missile defense systems in their territories. Although the missile systems are defensive, They have dual use potential, the ability to launch offensive missiles. These defensive missile systems can quickly be repurposed for offensive use as well. By 2004, nearly all of the Eastern European satellite states and Soviet-annexed countries, which are Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were enveloped into NATO. Now, free from the yoke of the Soviets, the majority of Eastern Europe not only politically and economically aligned with the West, but also militarily stood in solidarity with the West. Yet NATO did not desist in marching towards the Russian border. Unfortunately, after the US-led coup in Ukraine 2014, war has broken out between Ukraine and Russia, and now NATO missiles have been launched into the Russian homeland.